Okay, we got some great questions, way too many that we can deal with, but we'll ask them as they come. The first question has to do with the Gospel Coalition, and maybe you could tell some of the guys a little bit about the history of the Gospel Coalition, how it started, and what your guys' hopes are moving forward.
Gospel Coalition began from a conversation that Tim and I had in 2002. We went out for lunch together in New York City, stopped at a sidewalk cafe, and we have this sort of friendship where we get together and and set the whole universe to rights, and then look around for another universe. And it's one of those sorts of friendships, you know? And
we're always doing that, Kyle and I together. We're trying to fix the universe's problems.
It can be funny. It can be funny, and neither of us wants to be evangelical pope in any case. But nevertheless, to ask questions: if we could do something, what would it be? And one of the questions we were asking ourselves was: granted that there is no central organization or symbol-laden structure in North America today that represents confessional, reformed evangelicalism at its best, is there something we should be doing about it? And we could both remember the 50s and early 60s when people looked to Christianity Today as it then was with Carl Henry and his leadership. And people thought in terms of evangelistic outreach, in terms of Billy Graham. I mean, I remember as a boy listening to Billy Graham on the radio in the 1950s. It was part of a family ritual. And those of you who are of my age or older probably remember doing something of the same thing, you know. But although there are lots of good gospel folks around and good churches, yet nevertheless there was nothing that was central, a kind of rallying point. And we could all see the dangers and declines, but what would it take to start doing something? So eventually we wrote to about 40 pastors. They had to be pastors, they had to be broadly reformed, they had to be expositors, they had to be interested in evangelism. Those are the criteria. They had to be from different parts of the country, and they couldn't all be white. We didn't want it to be a white man's club. And we told them that we had no answers to all of these questions, but these are the questions we're raising, and would you like to come together for 3 days at Trinity? On your own tab, we don't have the money to pay for it, pay for it yourself. Trinity would pay for the food, and we'd talk, pray together, get to know one another, and see what the Lord would lay on our hearts. So that was 2005. And then out of that, we had the authority to write our foundation documents, our statement of faith, theological vision and ministry, which we then argued over line by line, line by line, line by line, for another couple of round of meetings. And eventually had the first mini conference in 2007. At the Trinity Chapel. We did no advertising except a bit online. We had 600 people. But what struck us about those early days is that the initial 40 that we asked to come, all 40 of them came. Nobody in the room knew everybody in the room, but all 40 came. And at the initial conference of 600, 70 or 75% were under the age of 40. And that led us to several strong decisions to go digital. It's the that's the world of the younger ones coming along. Go digital, make everything free on the digital world, and started setting goals and structures and so on. The name was chosen. We became a 501c3, started hiring people and so on. So the story is complex since then. It's now regionalized. There are branches in 6 or 8 countries that are all independent. We're not an American mission, but we'll help other countries start their own things. And now the website is pretty influential. On a low month, it gets about 5 million hits a month, and on a high month, it's 10 or 12. And that's what we can track. We've heard through the grapevine that a lot of the stuff is circulating very widely in China, for example, but there we're blocked. The Chinese tell us they all know how to climb the wall. And what that means is they're getting satellite VPN downloads, but we can't even count those. We know how many people hit our site from Sydney, Australia. We have no idea how many hit us from Beijing, but it's millions. And so Tim and I look at each other and we're amazed, bemused. What we find ourselves often doing is sort of after the fact, as the Lord opens up yet one more chapter, putting in place the structures and so on that help to sustain things. And the Lord keeps bringing in the money and the right people, and our executive director is a gift from God, Ben Pays. And so all of these things have conspired to make this a kind of rallying point. I suppose we have two decisive elements: a pretty robust theology in the broadly Reformed heritage. It's not minimalistic. And second, that we aim to be courteous. We will talk about anything and disagree, but we will be courteous. We will not be angry. And break either one of those and you're off our side. So that's who TGC is. Nowadays we have a women's conference as well, teaching women to be expositors, but it's not a conference about women and women's needs and women's concerns and women's goals. It's a conference about God and the gospel and exposition for women, by women. And so on every side we're interested in how the gospel ought to be central to what we're doing and shape everything rather than sort of the unarticulated assumption.
You mentioned last night that I think there's 6 revenue streams right now supporting this ministry. Yes. Why should these guys consider giving money from their churches or individually to the Gospel Coalition? And what are the financial needs right now?
Well, we have 11 full-time staffers, and the number of part-time staffers varies between 6 and 250, depending on what's going on. When we have conferences and so on, besides a lot of volunteer laborers, there are a lot of. If you have a conference of 8,000 or 10,000, it takes a lot of people to help run it. Then the website, everything is free to the end user, but that doesn't mean it's free. It costs quite a lot of money to run. And we now have to put in extra layers of security. We have been attacked and threatened, especially since we published some stuff on homosexuality. We've had hundreds of hate mails threatening to take us down, and attacks that have tried to come, but we spend a lot of money on security. And then we also produce books, all of which are free to the end users for poorer parts of the world. We've circulated over close to 600,000, more than 500,000 in 30-odd languages in various parts of the world, all free to the end user. And so all of those things take money. Those like myself on the council, we're not paid. Under 501c3 laws, we're the council. We're not supported in any way by them. Only our staffers are. And so we have no overhead in terms of buildings. Everything. Our senior staffers live in different cities. I mean, because we're a digital outfit. We have to have a legal residence, but you know, our executive director lives in Austin, Texas. We have a couple living in the Twin Cities. We have somebody living in San Diego. We have a couple living in the East Coast, and so on and so on. And so our overhead is just astonishingly small. But the various streams basically all come from donors or individuals or churches who put us on their budget because they think the money will be honestly used. You can get a certified statement at the end of the year, and the impact of TGC is it's frankly surprising. It just keeps multiplying.
You talked earlier about the centrality of the gospel. When you think about the mission of the Gospel Coalition to renew the contemporary church and the ancient gospel, describe for these guys what a gospel-centered church looks like, maybe in distinction from one that doesn't.
It's worth backing off first to remind ourselves of what the gospel is. For some people, the gospel is a fairly narrow subset of the Christian message, which tips people into the kingdom. And then after that, to get lives that are transformed, you introduce all your discipleship training courses. So gospel is a little bit that tips people in. That's all it is. You don't preach the gospel to Christians. You preach the gospel to outsiders. What you do inside is have all the training courses, you know, how to be happy though married, and 16 ways to balance your budget, and all those kinds of courses. And some of them that aren't bad as courses go, but they're not seen as intrinsic to or part of or subsumed under the gospel, but they're seen as something in addition to the gospel. Whereas all you have to do is go through your New Testament and look up every example of euangelion and euangelizomai and cognates, and see in what context these expressions occur, what it's talking about, to whom it's being preached and taught, and so on. And you discover that far from the gospel being a small subset of biblical truth, it's not all biblical truth. It's not confused with law. It's not everything. But it's a huge thing. And it's the huge thing under which a lot of other things lie, including discipleship. And so everything gets subsumed under another center where you need some clarity as to what the gospel is. Mark Dever likes to give his interns this assignment the first week that they're there. Define the gospel in one word. Define the gospel in one sentence. Define the gospel in one paragraph. Define the gospel in one page. Define the gospel in 10 pages. Go. Boy, that's good. That's good to get your thinking straight. You know, is it the gospel if it's it's the importance of accepting Jesus as your personal Savior. Is that the gospel? Well, apart from the fact that that expression isn't even found in the New Testament, you haven't been told anything about what God has done there. You've just been told what you must do and how to respond to it. It's not the gospel. So there needs to be clarity on what the gospel is. You start off with the fact that it's news. That's what it is. So some people put down the gospel is Jesus. That's one word. Or the gospel is grace. Well, it's not wrong, but it's not very rich and provocative and evocative, and it needs clarifying. So the gospel is the good news of what God has done. That's true, but God also made the universe. The gospel is the good news of what God has done in Christ Jesus. Better. But in what respect? The gospel is the good news of what God has done in Christ Jesus, primarily through his death and resurrection. The gospel is the good news of what God has done in Christ Jesus through his death and resurrection in order to remove our sin, turn aside the wrath of God, and prepare us for the new heaven and the new earth, a home of righteousness. Getting better. And then you can start throwing in some more realized eschatology and what it looks like and how you're supposed to respond to it. And pretty soon you have 10 pages that are including, clarity on propitiation and redemption and discipleship and conformity to Christ and union with Christ and justification, all the rest, But you have to start with clarity as to what the gospel is. And you've got to put down biblical text to justify every one of your clauses. Well, the one that I've given you in one sentence, all of it comes right out of 1 Corinthians 15. So a gospel-centered church will be one, first of all, where there is enormous clarity as to what the gospel is. It's so easy to transmute the gospel into a kind of pious moralizing that is more about what we do or must do or jolly well better do and hurry up and do, rather than about what God has done and is doing in Christ through his death and resurrection on our behalf and the bestowal of the Spirit and preparation in our lives to make us ready for the new king, the new heaven and the new earth, the home of righteousness. You see, it changes everything. And so a gospel-centered church will first and foremost be clear as to what the gospel is. Then second, it will keep Christ and his gospel at a structural center, so that so many other things are subsumed under it. So that whether you're working with the dirt poor or with missionary agencies or whatever, you're thinking all the time about what this looks like under the shadow of the cross in terms of proclamation for people's lives and serving them as Jesus served others under the shadow of the cross. So you're thinking big picture related back to a pretty well defined vision of what the gospel is in the first place. And that means that you never get to the horrible place where the gospel is something that's assumed. That happens in a lot of evangelical churches. No point preaching the gospel to this crowd. They're all Christians. They all know what the gospel is. We can assume that and go on to talking about the Ten Commandments or the book of Job or whatever you're going to talk about. But what you discover very quickly is in the New Testament, not least in the Paulines, the gospel is something that is preached to Christians as well as to non-Christians. And it shapes how people think, what discipleship looks like, the place of the cross in shaping people's lives. And so you can spot a gospel-centered church by the kind of preaching that ties so many things intelligently and through biblical texts, not arbitrarily, back to the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. And it begins to shape what the expectations are all the time and how people do their witness and evangelism and so on. I've rabbited on much too much, but that's the heart of it.
We've got about 7 minutes left.
If you want to do questions rather than the talk, I don't mind.
Okay, next question. And several guys asked this question. What theological issues do pastors need to be preparing to face in the next couple of years?
That's a very good question, but it's a hard question. Because in my opinion, in my experience, a lot depends on where you live. If you're the Pacific Northwest, so things are a little more secular and a little more cynical in some respects, but there's some conservative strands in the culture here too. Let me put it this way. The answer I would give in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the buckle on the Bible Belt, is not the same as the answer I would give in New England states. So that's what I mean by diversity. Moreover, there are some issues that are really important if you live in a university town and your church is next door to a major university, especially if Bart Ehrman's nearby. Then you've just got to understand the new perspective on Paul. On justification, you've got to read the new book by John Barclay, The Gift of God. It's going to set things off in another whole new direction. And so on and so on and so on. If you're not in a university town, you're a pastor of a small community, no college nearby, farming community, salt of the earth people, but they never heard of Tom Wright and probably never will, then the issues are a bit different. Do you see? So that's why I mean it is difficult to answer those sorts of questions. I don't want to lay half a dozen volumes on you to understand and know how to respond wisely and in a judicial way to the new perspective if you're never going to have to face that in the local church. But there are some things that all of us face in the Western world. The deceptiveness of materialism, the kind of media blasts that reflect the kind of new tolerance that we're talking about today, the complexities of church-state relations that are coming down, about which I'm going to talk in the next, moral issues, not least homosexuality. Many people who call themselves evangelicals now say that in the name of Christ we ought to allow anything that is an expression of love and so on. What right do we have? And are reinterpreting the biblical text. You've got to do some serious reading in the domain of homosexuality to know what the issues are and who's saying what and how to respond and think through those. No church is going to escape that one. And with it, coming down the pike, in larger churches, you're going to face transgender issues. That's coming. It's already here in some of our churches.
So along those lines, there really isn't a prestigious university. No offense if you went to Gonzaga, in the area like a Harvard or a whatever. We're mostly just average pastors serving in smaller churches. So what one or two books should we read to be well prepared to deal with that issue pastorally, the homosexual issue? It's the Kevin DeYoung book, others. Which books do you recommend that we read and give to our people in our churches?
If you've never read anything on the subject, or you have some lay people that have never read anything on the subject, the one by Kevin DeYoung isn't bad. There is, when the SCOTUS decision came down, one of the things we published on our website is a short article by Joe Carter. So you could find it on the website very quickly. Joe Carter, who lists 50 resources for Christians. And some of them are web resources, some of them are print resources and so on, but they're very good resources. And now there's more coming out all the time in this domain, but you fumble around in things on the website, and boy, there are lots of good resources listed there.
3 minutes left. You get the last one. 3 minutes. Help these guys evaluate the importance of certain doctrines. What is the time where these guys should say, this is something worth dividing over?
Yeah, that's another huge question. I don't know how you answer that in 3 minutes.
You have to. 2.5.
I recommend that we take some time away from the subsequent speaker. For what it's worth, at the risk of sounding like a personal peddler, one of the things we publish on the website is a journal called Themelios. It comes out 3 times a year, and it has probably the best and quickest set of book reviews. It's about 200 pages each fascicle. It comes out 3 times a year. And on the last fascicle, my editorial which is the first thing that shows up when you open up the thing digitally, is on disputable and non-disputable matters. So it's right on that issue. So that as a kind of preliminary to thinking about such things pastorally, maybe that's where to go. It is worth remembering that the Bible itself makes distinctions in hierarchy about what you die for and what you don't. In other words, there's some people who say, hey, it's in the Bible, I believe it, that settles it, don't relativize the Bible. If God says it, it's true, it's important, don't pretend otherwise. Well, it's true. God says that it's true, yeah, okay, well, I don't argue with that. But on the other hand, who of us would want to argue that what baptism for the dead means, which expression shows up precisely once in 1 Corinthians 15, is as important in Paul's thought as justification? So the way you decide what things are important and non-negotiable and worth dying on the hill for, depend on quite a lot of factors. Some are clearly earmarked. For example, what Paul says to the Galatians, though we or an angel from heaven speak any other gospel than that which we have preached to you, let him be anathema. So then you've got to understand what Paul means by gospel, but clearly that's a damning offense, because you could be preaching something that is actually sending people to hell because of your carelessness. On the other hand, when Paul says in Romans 14, one man is persuaded that one day is more important than another man is persuaded that all days are the same, let each be fully persuaded in his own mind, it's impossible to imagine Paul saying, one man regards adultery as okay, the other man regards adultery as bad, let each be fully persuaded in his own mind. And so you're forced to start asking fundamental questions about why are some conduct things flexible enough that Paul does not say, regarding the day thing, he does not say, well, it's not important, don't argue about it. Or let's not talk about that. He doesn't say either of those things. He says it's complex and people are going to come to different views, and I'm not even trying to talk you out of it. By all means, be persuaded in your own mind. In your own church, go ahead. Preach it, teach it. Just don't divide over it. Do you see? That's rather different from the kinds of things that he says about justification, for example. And so to establish a hierarchy of things becomes part of theological maturation. I know a lovely man. If I mention his name, some of you would know him. He's a Scot, a godly man, and when he became pastor of a Presbyterian church in Scotland, in Australia, he brought a fair bit of his, not only his Presbyterianism, which I so largely admire, with him, but of Scottish culture with him. And when he found out that some Australian Christians were spending Sunday afternoons on Bondi Beach instead of in dark three-piece suits, he was horrified and virtually split the church. If you are absolutely persuaded that you can argue logically and coherently from swimming on Bondi Beach back through categories of day and moral law and 10 Commandments to the eternal character of God so that you've got to die on that hill, well, go ahead, brother, God bless you. But for myself, I'm not persuaded that it comes into the ranks of what Paul calls of first importance. And so every minister who's involved in things, especially if you're involved in things cross-culturally, faces that. I mean, I was brought up in French Canada, and eventually some French Canadians became missionaries to France. Most of them were teetotalers and did not do well there. In this country, I don't drink alcohol. In France, I enjoy it. What can I say? To the Jews, I became a Jew that I might win the Jews, and to the French, I became a Frenchman that I might win the French. And so figuring out those kinds of things on a biblically theological stable basis rather than a personal preference and cultural indoctrination is really very important. The last element in this consideration, I know I'm way over 2.5 minutes, but I don't care. The last element is dividing in what context. Do you see, in something like the Gospel Coalition, we have both Baptists and Paedo-Baptists. But all our council members are churchmen who are actively involved in their own denominations. So a Baptist like Mark Dever is persuaded that a Presbyterian like Lig Duncan is just plain wrong. I almost was tempted to say that he's all wet, but but that's all right. Lig is persuaded that Mark is all wrong too. And both of them are persuaded that it is important to establish one way or the other in the context of the local church to make a cohesive church polity. But TGC is not a church and it's not a denomination. And meanwhile, there are some churches, like the Free Church of America, that have managed to hold that polity more flexibly too. You can be either Paedo-Baptistic or Baptistic in the Free Church. But that's making a value judgment about what hill you're wanting to die on. And we may not all agree, but even to come to fundamental agreement about what the hills are to die on, and then some disagreement about whether the next range of hills is to die on or not, there's going to be some flexibility there. Whereas those who are trained in thinking negation and absolutes in every vista, you've got to agree with them about 98%, or you can't have fellowship with them. And I think that in a day and generation when conservative Christians who are really in love with clarity on the gospel need to be banding together to hold together, it really becomes more and more important where you draw the line and what you fight over and what you don't fight over. You watch two groups of Christians come together for a coffee party, a coffee club, a bunch of pastors in a Spokane, for all I know. And you'll find two or three of them in every conversation they start trying to find out where they disagree with you or where you disagree with them. And you'll find others, when they get together, they're first and foremost glorying in the commonalities of the faith and the glories of Christ and the resurrection. And it's a different mindset. Now, you have to get to the disagreements, but boy, if you start there and start drawing your lines right there, eventually you're going to have a very narrow circle of friends who are all justifying you for approving the same biases that they do. Does that help at all?
You went 5 minutes over, but at least you were being authentic to yourself, so that's okay, right? Yeah.